Be seated. All right, we'll hear closing arguments beginning with the state.
If you go to the cops, it will be your last act on this earth. I personally guarantee it. Those were the defendant's words 6 days before Jamie Robinson was killed. Those were the defendant's words, and the defendant, she told you herself. She was trying to be intimidating. Those were the defendant's words when she thought that Jamie Robinson might go to the cops. So what happened when the defendant learned that this man actually was a police officer? The defendant's roommate told her to fix it. You don't talk about another human being like a problem that needs to be fixed unless you stop seeing that person as a man and you started seeing that person as an obstacle. And that's what makes this case so tragic. Because Jamie Robinson was an undercover police officer who was trying to do his job. He was putting his life on the line to protect the people of Midlands. But when he became a problem for the defendant and her roommate, the defendant took his life. And that's why the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. As the judge will tell you, the elements of that crime are straightforward. We had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant killed Officer Robinson and that she did so as part of a premeditated plan. And once we've shown you that, we've met our burden, even if you think Alex Everett might have been involved in all of this. Because it's not a defense to murder to say, I didn't do it alone. The only defense is I didn't do it. And we know the defendant did this. We know it because we did exactly what Mr. Gupta told you we would at the beginning of this trial. We followed the blood. We followed the blood through each stage of this crime. From the dock to the bat, from the bat to the mask, and from the mask back to the defendant. So let's start with this dock. Members of the jury, we can all agree that this man was killed right here on the dock at the Midlands Marina. But the defendant wants you to believe she never went there. But then why would two people who have never even met each other prove to you the defendant was there? Robin Wheeler saw the defendant's car. Dakota Mansager saw the defendant's face. And members of the jury, it's not like Robin Wheeler just saw some random assortment of numbers and letters on that license plate. It was a vanity plate. The same license plate the defendant took that stand and admitted to you that was on her car. And then Dakota Mansager, it's not like he saw the defendant's profile for a split second in a dark alley. He saw the defendant's face for 15 seconds in a well-lit parking lot. And then the defense's other witness, Sam Fisher, he doesn't change any of that. Because what he told you was that the attacker was wearing a mask. And members of the jury, the only reason he couldn't see the defendant's face was because the defendant, like Dakota Mansager told you, had already put on that mask. And so then the defense, they also brought you Taylor Strombaum. And they told you her testimony It refutes everything that those people at the Midlands Marina saw. Members of the jury, if any picture is worth 1,000 words, it's this one. And Taylor Strombaum and Sam Fisher, the defense's first two witnesses, they have something in common. See, they both took that stand. They told you a lot of jokes, and then they told you that what they said in their sworn statements was different from what they're saying today. Members of the jury, what's to make you believe that the defendant didn't do the same thing? So then we followed that blood, the bat. Now we know, members of the jury, that this bat, the murder weapon, belonged to the defendant's roommate. But all that really proves is that the defendant had access to the murder weapon. So then the defense, they tried to confuse you. They tried to bring in all this information about right hand or left hand. And maybe, members of the jury, maybe that matters if this were a game of baseball. But it's not a game of baseball. And members of the jury, it doesn't matter which side you normally swing on or which side you claim you swing on if you're going to walk up behind someone and hit them with a bat. And the physical evidence proves that's exactly what the defendant did, because Detective Defoe, he only found 2 people's blood on the murder weapon. Officer Robinson's on the barrel, the defendant's on the handle. So then we followed that blood to the ski mask. Members of the jury, again, it was the same 2 people's blood. That's not a coincidence. And the defendant, she knows that. The defense, they didn't have a burden today. That was on us alone. But the judge is going to tell you that because the defendant chose to come to court today, chose to take that stand, you're allowed to ask whether what she told you makes sense. And it doesn't. Because nothing the defendant said on that stand explains why her blood and Jamie Robinson's blood were on this ski mask, why her blood and Jamie Robinson's blood were on that bat. So the defendant's excuses, they bring us back to this March 18th email. Because the defendant, we want you to think about what she's asking you to believe. That she gets this email from her roommate saying it's all over BNN, we're so dead. That she then goes to BNN's website, sees this news article, but doesn't connect the dots. This wasn't complicated. The defendant was dealing drugs. The defendant knew this man was an undercover police officer, and the defendant knew exactly what she had to do when her roommate told her to fix it. And so the defendant did. And she might have tried to cover it up. She might have tried to put this ski mask in a sealed garbage bag somewhere, but members of the jury, the defendant couldn't cover up her blood. That's why we ask that you follow the blood. From the dock to the bat. From the bat to the mask, and from the mask straight to the defendant. We ask that you find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. We'll hear from the defense.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court? Counsel. Ladies and gentlemen. If there's one thing that the summation of the evidence from the state was full of, it was the word defendant. How many times they say it, Mr. Zoo? 34 times. Ms. Villani got up here and said, defendant, 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 defendant. But the statement she just made to you, ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't help but notice that it was missing two things: evidence and Alex Everett. And there's a reason for that, ladies and gentlemen. I find it a little ironic that when Ms. Villani comes up here, she talks to you about treating people as obstacles, because it seemed all day long like the defense has brought an obstacle that the state can't overcome. And that's Alex Everett. They've got the wrong student. And the reason that their argument didn't have much evidence is because they're telling the wrong story. Now, this is a first-degree murder case, and that means that the state comes into court holding a burden of proof. And regardless of whether or not Mr. Fisher wants to help the police, or Mr. Monsager says he loves the police, it's our job not just to convict someone because an officer's died, but to convict the right person. And that means that it's the state's job to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it wasn't just anybody, but actually Miss Sinclair who killed Jamie Robinson. And we'll talk more about what that standard means, how high that standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. But just know for the moment, ladies and gentlemen, they haven't met it. Let's look at the three witnesses that they called to the stand. First, they call Officer Robinson's widow. And sure, Officer Robinson's widow, Robin Wheeler, says that when she arrived at the Midlands Marina on March 18th, she saw a silver Honda. But she couldn't tell us who drove that car. Couldn't tell us if it was Skylar Sinclair. Couldn't tell us if it was Alex Everett. And today in court, we heard that somebody other than Skylar Sinclair had access to Skylar Sinclair's car, because Alex Everett also used that car to store her baseball bat. And on cross-examination, when Ms. Cohen was asking questions to Ms. Wheeler, what we learned was something that the state had hid from you on direct examination. That it was Alex Everett, not Skylar Sinclair, who was the mastermind of the conspiracy between the two of them. That it was Alex Everett, not Skylar Sinclair, who was skeptical of Officer Robinson's involvement. And that it was Alex Everett, not Skylar Sinclair, who was in touch with that dangerous drug dealer that the state would have you believe was Skylar's motive, not Alex's, today in court. Then they call their second witness, Mr. Defoe, to the stand. And sure, he can put on a nice demonstration. He can talk about blood. The state can say, follow the blood, but follow the blood where? Mr. Zhu comes up here and starts cross-examining Mr. Defoe, and what we learn is that the state has no explanation for how the blood belonging to the defendant got onto those objects. We didn't hear any evidence of a struggle. Didn't hear any evidence of cuts at the scene of the murder. Heard that Skylar's blood was not found on the docks, and heard from Mr. Defoe that that blood could have gotten on there months earlier at softball practice. And ladies and gentlemen, that's just not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And Ms. Villani has the audacity to come up here and say that when the defendant was testifying, she couldn't offer you an explanation for why her blood was on those objects. Well, ladies and gentlemen, take Ms. Villani at her word, because the state couldn't either. And what about the third witness that they called to the stand, Mr. Monsager? Well, his story has changed quite a bit since the time that he claims he saw all these things. First, he wasn't sure whether or not that object he saw was a bat or a fishing rod, and then after he saw the publicity, he changes his mind and is sure. Isn't it possible that the same thing is true for his identification of the person who got out of the car? We saw how far away Mr. Monsager was. Do you think you would be sure, beyond all reasonable doubt sure, that somebody you saw from that distance for a few seconds, who you'd never seen before, on a foggy night through a window behind a pump, you think that you'd be certain that that person is somebody specific the next day? And we know that Mr. Monsager wasn't, because when he first saw the photo of the person he claims today he's sure he saw, he didn't say a word. Their case, their closing, it's missing evidence. And it's also missing Alex Everett. They've got the wrong student. They've told the wrong story. Today, We told you about Alex Everett. We called a witness who saw the masked person that committed this crime. And he told you that he saw certainly that that person was 6 feet tall, limping, and swung right-handed. Now, the state comes up here and says it isn't a baseball game. The direction of the swing doesn't matter. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're right-handed, you swing a bat right-handed. If you're left-handed, you swing a bat left-handed. And it does matter because the defendant is left-handed, Alex Everett is right-handed, and we know based on the testimony of the only person who saw this happen that the killer is right-handed. I mean, think about it, folks. They're saying that you can just ignore Alex Everett. When Alex Everett is somebody with the same motive, the same opportunity, we know that Alex Everett was thinking about needing to kill Jamie Robinson at the time that this all happened because of the email that they introduced into evidence from Miss Everett. And not only that, she better matches the physical characteristics of the person who was seen committing the crime. Right-handed, 6 feet tall, limping. That's reasonable doubt, ladies and gentlemen. They've got the wrong student. They're telling the wrong story. And if that's not enough, we actually called to the stand another student who saw the defendant at the time that the state would have you believe that she killed Officer Robinson. She came to the stand, she swore an oath, and she told you under that oath that she was sitting in a room with Miss Sinclair at the time that they say Miss Sinclair was 45 minutes away from campus killing Jamie Robinson. And that's reasonable doubt too, but there's a reason that Miss Strombaum was able to come forward and identify Sinclair as being in that room. It's because Miss Sinclair just simply did not kill Officer James Robinson. They've got the wrong student and they're telling the wrong story. Now, I promised I'd come back to reasonable doubt because it's not an intuitive concept. We don't really have anything like it in our regular lives. Usually when somebody tells you a story, they don't include all the facts. There are some holes. There are some things you need to plug up, make inferences, make presumptions about how the story would be filled in to support their story. But the law says that whenever we get to a place in the state story where a presumption need be made, there's only one presumption we can make: innocence. Let me give you an example. You might ask why. If the state says Skylar Sinclair killed Officer James Robinson, and we know that Miss Sinclair is 5'9", was the killer observed as being 6 foot tall? Now, I'm sure there are a bunch of presumptions we could make, how to patch those things together. The presumption that the law requires us to make is innocence. Why? If the state says that Skylar Sinclair killed James Robinson, was Skylar Sinclair seen somewhere else at the time we know Officer Robinson was killed? Presumption, innocence. Why? If the state says that Skylar Sinclair killed James Robinson, and we know that the killer swung right, do we also know that Skylar Sinclair is lefty? Presumption, innocence. There are so many whys in this case left by this state, and every single time we can presume innocence. And that is reasonable doubt. They've got the wrong student, and they're telling the wrong story. I'll try another case, as will Mr. Zhu and Miss Villani, but on this. Skylar Sinclair's one day in court, we ask that you find her not guilty.
Thank you, counsel. Rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. Not a single person has tried to tell you that Alex Everett wasn't a dangerous person. But Alex Everett wasn't the one who threatened to kill Jamie Robinson. This defendant was. Alex Everett wasn't the one who went to the Midlands Marina and who was seen there. But the defendant was, and Alex Everett wasn't the one who left behind a trail of blood. The defendant was. That's why we ask that you find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, counsel. Case has been well presented. The jurors will complete their ballots and will remain in place for a moment.
I think we should give our two teams a rousing